Hello and welcome to another episode of Teaching Heroes, a teaching podcast where I ask teachers and educators, what does it take to turn up every day and create tomorrow's leaders? And today, a very special guest, we have Tom Barrett, leadership coach, owner of Dialogic Learning and many things. Tom, thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great to connect with you, Jo.
And I was just telling Tom that I came across Tom Barrett's work because he works with two very close principals to my heart, and I've always been inspired by their leadership. And knowing that, Tom, you've coached them for so long, I had to hear about the what you do with them to create and learn, inside knowledge about your coaching. So thank you for coming on and sharing your journey with us.
Yeah, great. It's been an interesting sort of path. And coaching is, one of the elements where I kind of spend a lot of my time at the moment.
Yeah, great. Okay, so can you tell us, Tom, what are you doing right now? What's the framework of your business? And it'd be great to hear about where you are now.
So my own business is called Dialogic Learning, and it's a education consultancy, and has kind of three main areas of work as I'm trying to support schools. So coaching is something that is a sort of a key vehicle for that change. I see it's one of the it's a really potent tool within our change kind of toolkit. Something that has great potential for development and change. And so coaching is something that kind of drives a lot of the different things that I do, not just the kind of formalized one-to-one coaching, but also some of the other work. So I also support individual schools as a group of leaders or a group of teachers as well. So work as a consultant supporting schools in development and growth. And also I support educational architectural projects as well. So I support the development of changes in learning environments and sort of work both sides of that problem, sort of supporting architectural design teams. So supporting them in understanding the world of education, and then helping educators and school leaders navigate their way through major learning environments projects and sort of school building development. So those sort of three different parts of my work at the moment are kind of the things that that's the kind of framework for what I do.
Yeah, right. And is it just you as part of the business, or do you have a team of coaches that you work with?
No, just me at the moment.
It's incredible the impact you're having, and it's just you.
Yeah, just me. I think it's just an interesting thing to think about, actually, how you scale something that's fundamental to me, something that I believe in, the value of relationships and partnerships. So I often say partnerships, not projects. And one thing I try to seek out are people that are ready for the work over a longer period of time. Looking for real and authentic change that takes time, doesn't it? And it takes application and persistence and kind of some of the boring bits of innovation as well. I think there's a blog post I'm ready to write about the boring bits of innovation.
Right.
It's not all sometimes it's about that persistent and continuous application of the things that we know will work over time. And I know that partnerships are the things that I filter my work for, so I look for those. And that's sometimes hard to scale because you're kind of working in a kind of very relational sort of sense with people. And so it's not easy just to kind of create more widgets of those, you kind of want to, you're actually seeking less. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, but it's the sort of thing I know that will lead, and I've experienced leads to much more significant change for individuals. And then those individuals are able to kind of galvanize that within their schools, within their organization.
Yeah. There's so much there. Can we go back to the innovation, the boring bits of innovation? What can you give me an example? Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's that last phase where you're implementing. So innovation is, we often get our kind of attention gets drawn to parts of it where it's the disruption, it's the initial disruption of change, or it's the new ideas. And so I kind of have a simple mental model for innovation, which is about, curiosity, developing ideas, and then just the simple implementation of those ideas. And that's the part, I think, where it gets a little bit boring, where it's actually, you just have to keep going sometimes, and I think that continuous application and compounding of a good idea has the, potential of making significant change. And so I just think there's something interesting about that kind of notion of taking an idea where we get very excited. We have that initial burst of energy around the newness of it. And we sometimes also get the negative side effects of that. But the longer tail of innovation is something that we probably don't spend enough time thinking or talking about as leaders and as people working in kind of leadership.
That makes me, I don't know whether this is quite what you're saying, but is there something there about practice and rehearsal? Because I often say that to my new teachers, is that, you might have an idea or a teaching strategy and you do it and it doesn't quite work out the way you think. And that it might not necessarily be that the idea was a bad idea. It's just that you need to practice and you need to rehearse and you need to go over it again. Is that? Yeah,
that's exactly it. So that ability, so, that part, we might bail on that idea really too soon. And I think, the idea of compound growth and application and persistence over time, those sorts of things, that's a good example is that idea of a new practice as a teacher, just like trying something different or using a particular pedagogical tool, whether that's like a questioning strategy or something simple, is the ability to kind of apply that multiple times over time in a persistent way. You might say that that's a bit boring rather than jumping to another thing.
Yes, yeah, because as you say, you've gone through this period of intense thinking and coming up with creative ideas, and then the implementation. It's just like the day after day implementation of it. It's not going to happen, or like the innovation or the change isn't going to happen straight away. It's that time. Sorry. And I was just going to say, is that why you stay with schools and you stay with your partnerships for long periods of time, to ensure that the implementation and the momentum keeps going?
Yeah, I think so. But it also, so yes, that idea of compound growth is really important. There's a few other things that also change. I think that we will naturally be more ambitious with a longer kind of scope. I think we tend to we're not quite as sort of attracted to sort of short-term quick fixes, because we're in a different we're working at a different pace. And because of that pace, it also changes the dynamic of people supporting you. And so, I understand, as a consultant kind of supporting into schools, it can be a kind of a bit of a peculiar relationship for some schools who might never experience that. And I know that I am best supporting kind of leaders and teachers and schools when I'm in that longer term relationship where there isn't really any airs and graces. It's just, we're just getting on with it, you're part of a team and you're continuing. And so the pace is different. And what that actually looks like is it changes it from being like a highly intense structured workshop to being a slower, more deliberate application of good collaborative techniques. And so over time that, you're able to work at a much more sustainable pace with people. And so partnerships give you that. Partnerships enable that. It's not a project. It's not a single curriculum day, which I think in the past we've kind of got sucked into just doing, you get those high peak kind of experiences where everybody's excited and motivated, but the true application of that, the real change that actually we all want, isn't necessarily connected to that. It doesn't always lead back to that single moment. And so, that's some of the success I've had with working with schools is just connecting to teams, working at a pace that is sustainable, creating the right conditions for dialogue, creating the right conditions for good collaboration, and then working over a longer period of time.
I think you're also pointing to one of those essential parts of education that we often overlook is that it's about relationship. You can't kind of go into a classroom once and build a sustainable relationship. As you say, it might be a great experience and the students might learn something, but the real change and the real innovation is going to happen as you build relationship with your students. And I would think the same, what you're kind of saying as a consultant as well, is it's important for you to build that relationship with leaders, with teachers, in order to build, so what gets built in that relationship then that makes it more sustainable?
Yeah, I think it's that shared understanding, but it's also standards as well. I think you think about this idea that you have as a, and this is true for all of us working with students, you kind of create these shared heuristics, which are like our standard of working together. It's like, that's a point in time where we achieve something great, whether that was a lesson, a session, a conversation, an example of work that was shared and there was a good feedback conversation around it. What you're doing is, over time, you're kind of creating that story, and you're able to then say to that student, or say to a group of teachers or to a leader, you're able to point them back to those moments to say, that's, remember that time when we were working really well, we did this, it was working well. That idea of kind of sharing a story with people, I think that's something that you gain from time. You don't gain from really short kind of bursts of projects where it feels very surface level. And because of that, there's a type of understanding which, isn't quite as easy to kind of describe or define when you're with a group of people that just know you well. It doesn't feel like we're performing. That's the other thing I think is important. It doesn't feel like there's this pressure for performance, and that happens on all sides. When there's like this supposed person, expert or visitor or whatever, that there's this immediate raising of sort of this sense of performance, and I think that's an inhibitor, I think, of good development and growth and openness and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's just it's an interesting thing that over time we share an understanding and our story is shared and created together. And that's something that then weaves into the way that you work with people.
I guess as you're kind of building that background of relatedness then too, you'd be chipping away at that performance exterior as you have. You kind of recreated me there for a minute, because I'm a drama teacher as well. And it's like, you do have that element of switching it on, of generating yourself in a certain way. And there's nothing wrong with that, but as you say, it's not going to create the sustainable, you're not going to really connect with the people you're working with if you're continually performing with them.
I think you're right. If you're continually at that surface level, like what's behind the veneer,
Yes.
Like what is that? Like when do you get to the point where you talk about the real challenge and what it really means to kind of move on as a leader and as a teacher? There's a iceberg model of coaching where they talk about what's above the surface, what's below the surface, is just a great kind of visual that kind of makes us think, there's a lot below the surface that we often don't talk about, but is actually the thing that kind of drives who we are as teachers, our identities. And this is true for any, relationship, as we're helping, students to kind of grow and be better people. There's a lot that's going on. And so how do you create, and this is ultimately what it's about. This question is ultimately what, I'm kind of working on most of the time. How do you create the ideal conditions for great dialogue to kind of to flourish? Like, how do you create that space? How do you create an environment where people feel safe enough to be able to be open with people? And so that's ultimately what I'm always investing in, whether that's in coaching or in a workshop. I'm still trying to create the right conditions for that. And when you do, you're much more likely to reveal or to create the kind of right environment for someone to step up, to take the masks off, the various masks and hats or whatever the version is,
So how do you do that? How do you create that environment for dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, it's time is a useful, compounder, as we've just described. So over time, you're more likely to. I think that you can quickly do it. I know that I recently ran some sessions for teachers across Europe and EMEA, the EMEA region, so Middle East and Africa, and I was doing some online sessions, small group. So I think sometimes the size of your group makes a big difference, and that simple tactic of as a workshop designer, a learning designer, recognizing that immediately changes whether people feel willing to step up or not, is that's something that I pay really close attention to. So we had small groups in those online sessions, and even though it was digital, we were online, we were able to quickly sort of generate some rapport and create some connections with people. A simple tactic that I use is I try to get everybody in the group to contribute within the first sort of 5 minutes. And so it's a really straightforward thing to do, and it isn't kind of icebreaker territory, which is a bit cliche, which I'm fine with, but really what you're actually asking is that mechanism of, I've said something into this group and it wasn't that bad, and I'm okay now. I'm like, I've said something, like I've shared something, it wasn't a disaster. That's ultimately what you want everybody in the room to kind of go through. And what that does, it just kind of allows everybody to contribute. You're much more likely to contribute in the rest of the session. So you're dealing with, that psychological safe space. And that's not something that you can just say that you want and it magically appears. You have to build it.
Is there something in the way that you're being in that as well that contributes to that safety? Is there an element of vulnerability that you bring, or attentiveness, or what is it that you bring then to that safety?
Well, I mean, I think one of the key things, I suppose, is as a facilitator. So if we were, if we're thinking about how do you design that, how do you deliberately create that space, whether you're a facilitator, teacher, coach, or otherwise, we're all trying to create that environment. I think one of the things is paying attention to the rules or the protocols within that space. And so that's something that I deliberately do. I often talk about threshold time. And this is in the idea of moving from whatever you've just been doing into this space, and making a really deliberate, making deliberate signals to the group that we're now into this new environment, new space, new time. These are the things that are expected of you. So setting clear expectations and using talking protocols are a simple way that you could establish like a new set of rules within that environment. And that just makes it really clear to people, like, what is it that, what's expected of me during this. And then those rules allow people to kind of go, okay, I see that this is being structured and facilitated. It gives me a sense that there's order and organization and someone's leading this. That is another thing that contributes, I think, to people feeling a little bit safer and more willing to contribute.
And is that common? You obviously work across a lot of different, fields with schools and other organizations and across the world. Is that then common amongst all groups, that approach?
No, I think it's becoming, I think it can be done in a very tokenistic way. And so what we're talking about is in your meetings, like, like no technology or switch off your mobile phones, those types of things. For me, that sort of meeting kind of rules is one version of this, which isn't the most effective. I think so. Yes, I think we see lots of that, and I'm sure you've been in many meetings across the different campuses and various places where people say, this is the way that we do things. Here's and some not at all. But the most effective are the ones where we talk about the type of behavior and the type of talk and the type of thinking that's going on in that session. And we're trying to describe those conditions. So for example, we might say, we have an expectation to step up and step back. And so this is a protocol that I use at the beginning of every kind of workshop, stepping up and stepping back. So there's an expectation on you. So if I was explaining it, I'd be like, there's an expectation on you as part of this session to contribute your ideas. You're here not just to warm up a seat, you know, you're here to contribute. So step up, but you've also got to be mindful of stepping back to allow other people the space to contribute their thinking. So be mindful of the balance. And so stepping up and stepping back is a simple way of saying this is the expectation. And that's different than saying no mobile phones, or don't check your email.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
It's totally different. It's in the kind of roughly the same space, but it doesn't have quite the same sort of effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And in that stepping back as well, then there is that space to, you know, contribute, you know, to the listening of the space as well, which is quite important, I think.
Yeah, so important. I mean, you know, I think silence is often underrated, you know, and it's but you're right. I mean, it's often we want to fill that kind of void with something, you know. Actually, one of my favorite talk protocols is the WAIT protocol, which is an acronym for Why Am I Talking, which is one of my favorites. I think it's quite hard to do because you have to kind of trigger that thought and that sequence before you say anything. But you're trying to give yourself a little bit of thinking space, a thinking time. And actually, you know, generally speaking, thinking time is poorly invested in. We don't kind of have enough time just to stop and think through our responses before we start to fill the space with some talk.
Yeah. I think I'm going to take that one on, because I'm one of those people in groups who's like, you know, continually sharing all the time. So it's one of those things that I personally need to take on, is that stepping back and really learning in the listening of others. So yeah, I'm taking on that one, because it is, you know, you do feel that sense of wanting the, you know, group to move on. And as you say, there's not that appreciation for just the time it takes for people to digest what you've just said or what someone else has just said, in order to then, you know, contribute back. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that there's that, it's a classic thing of, you know, our assumptions is that, you know, the lens that we have is not necessarily the same as everybody else's. If we connect this to also like a design thinking methodology or a creative thinking methodology, I think it's interesting to kind of make that connection here, because what we're talking about is you know, how we invest maybe in more thinking time in our meetings, in our sessions, in our workshops. But one of the key places it plays a really big role is in the development of new ideas. So if you're ever in a moment where you're trying to encourage or facilitate ideas, then the ability to slow the pace down is really, really important. And it's one of the things that I always try to do, is just to build in like 5 minutes independent thinking time. That's all it is. There's no kind of fancy kind of process or method. It's just, okay, before we share our thinking together, or before we create some ideas or go through this method, whatever the method is, I just want you to spend 5 minutes on your own thinking about this, you know. Write down some stuff if you want, or not, but just giving people that time has always made the next shared time much, much better. You know, it kind of creates this little kind of bit of room for people just to kind of go, okay, like, what's going on? What's the problem? What's the situation? What's the strategy? What is it? And let me connect the dots before I start to have to perform in that kind of group again, like put my ideas out there. And so that's something that makes a really big difference.
You know, I was just really struck by, then I was thinking about how little time we actually give students to that deep thinking. There's always this sense of needing to do something all the time, that they're constantly needing to be on task in something. And there's not that time to think. And I think for young children in particular, that might look like distraction or wandering eyes, or it's not going to look like David like that. It's going to look like something that doesn't look like thinking, you know, and yeah, as you said that, I was like, wow, the little, and as a, you know, also as a new, you know, stepped into executive roles this year, like there are just so many meetings all the time.
Yes.
And I was like, when do I get time to, contribute ideas or I mean, obviously within the meetings there is that space, but there is that little time to just kind of sit together and just think and create. And I think create is what is, you know, sometimes missing.
Yeah, you're right. I think so. If you think about what you just described, the number of meetings, the number of lessons, the number of, you know, tutorials and sessions and whatever people are experiencing, our time is becoming more and more fractured.
Yes. And
fragmented. Yes. And what then happens is that somebody in one of those fragments fragments it further into smaller and smaller pieces and kind of keeps us moving through something. And actually, when we're trying to develop ideas, and it's specifically to do with that, I mean, it's particularly at that point where you need to be able to do both, go quickly and go slowly. It's like the ability to work intensely in a team, but then be able to kind of slowly incubate and kind of mull over and ponder on those ideas. And that balance is what you're seeking. One is no better than the other. We all respond differently to those things, but you kind of want to have both. You want to be able to do really intense work, but then you also want a time where there isn't as much pressure. And so I remember doing a workshop with a group of teachers in South Australia where we were actually at Adelaide Zoo. And we kind of organized the idea sort of session to happen just before lunch. And then they kind of did a really intense ideation sort of session, and then had lunch, and they had a chance to go around the zoo and have a wander about. But it was deliberate. It was part of the design, you know, where we gave them room and space to be able to do something else. And although that feels like it's sort of non-space, when you're really intentional about that, it makes a big difference. Think about the times when you come up with your, you know, those crazy ideas. Is often not when you're like working intensely on the problem. It's often when you're doing something else. And, you know, that's true of so many of us that, you know, we can use that as an intentional piece of our design. So helping our students to know that we can switch off and do something else is a powerful method for connecting the dots.
A little interruption there, but yeah, I was just thinking of when I was writing my PhD that I'd often go do reading and then I'd get stuck on something and I'd go do housework, and then often while I was washing up, I'd come up with and then I had these wet hands. I was like, I need to write this down. Just like go back and.
It's so weird, isn't it? That happens like that. You know, our brain works in amazing ways, and it's like connecting the dots. You got to collect the dots. You know, Bruce Nussbaum talks about, you know, you've got to collect the dots if you want to connect the dots. And I think that's a nice way. I often think about it like that. You know, you've got to have ways to kind of have input, and you've got to be able to kind of see those pieces clearly if you want to make better connections. But definitely when we step away from something, it's actually in that act and in doing something else that we're kind of, our brain will continue to work on it, even though we might not feel like we are.
And how did you come up, you know, what led you to this sort of thinking then, Tom? Like what's your, you know, what was your journey into education and into education consulting?
Yeah, so I used to be a primary school teacher in England. So I worked in England for 10 years as a primary school teacher, and was really, worked in 3 different schools and ended up in school leadership and was on a sort of normal sort of leadership trajectory. And yeah, I mean, and a lot of that time was spent working with technology in primary education and exploring the emerging spaces of Web 2.0 back then, you know, and, you know, I had been writing an educational blog and writing in that space and connecting with people around the world using Twitter and things. And so being in that kind of space where we were, and it was like we were, it felt like this kind of quite a small community of people, practitioners kind of figuring stuff out thinking about how we could use technology to support great learning. And I think it was that really has certainly shaped me the most in terms of the way the way I'm curious about the world around me. Though I'm kind of my viewpoints are quite broad. I tend to kind of look quite see things in big ways. I encourage and kind of want lots of input, and it maybe is probably from some of those early days of being connected to quite a wide variety of diverse people around the world who are all trying to figure new things out. And so got into school leadership and didn't really, and that really didn't kind of, work out for me. I had a really difficult year as a deputy principal.
Right.
And it wasn't what it was all cracked up to be.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it actually wasn't, I kind of realized that it wasn't really, on reflection, it wasn't me, and it wasn't my intent, will, or ambition or skill. It was actually the environment around me. And so I've long been able to kind of sort of process that. But it was a very difficult year, because some really low points, sort of poor mental health, really, really difficult kind of times where I didn't really feel I had any avenue to kind of get out of it, any support mechanisms, none of the things that I think every emerging leader, school leader, should have around them. And so decided to keep kind of looking and go beyond that. And joined a chap called Ewan McIntosh at Notosh and his consultancy. And that was, one of those situations where you hand your notice in without a job to go to. I'm not sure if that's one of those situations, but like we all experienced that. But it's there wasn't the opportunity with you, and it was just like, I have to do something. And it was like, sometimes it feels like your career is just sort of happening to you.
Yes.
Like it's out of your control. And the one thing I could control was that. And so I decided that I was going to turn away from teaching, which was very vocational for me. It was like very much like this is my calling, And so that was some really difficult decisions around about that time. But through kind of the connections that I built up, and I'd been writing and creating and sharing and building networks, I had a portfolio that was out there, and people, and I think that this is something that's often, we don't talk about this enough, but kind of writing and creating in public is such a powerful thing, for building a portfolio of thinking.
Yes.
You can go back to my site and see blog posts when I was, teaching, kindergarten.
Yeah.
More than a decade ago.
Yes.
And I think that's just an interesting thing I'm going to carry with me throughout all of my life is a portfolio of thinking, not just about career, but just what was I thinking at those times. And, and so that proved a really powerful, that created a powerful opportunity for me, just to be able to, people knew what I was doing at that particular point.
I just realized that's what I've been doing with the podcast over the last year, is building that network, absolutely, of amazing thinkers and educators, and also keeping my thinking going as well in education. So so you joined a consultancy and then
we were working together for about 5 years, and Ewan's work, we were exploring all sorts of different things, and I really treasure those times because I as a primary school teacher was kind of thinking, we're just going to continue to work with more schools. Yes. And so we're in the UK, but and it was much bigger than that. I kind of started to realize, that there's a whole world out here of learning and development and education in so many different places and spaces. And so we did all sorts of different fascinating projects, working, with loads of different types of organizations outside of education. I think those sorts of times, those types of experiences are so kind of rare, I think, for us to kind of go outside of our industry and try to work in spaces where we might not be an expert. And I think it's in those sorts of times and, where I started to formulate the methodologies around coaching, where I was working with teams who, you know, I didn't necessarily know anything about what, you know, their expertise, but I was in a facilitation type role. I was in a coaching type role. And I've definitely, my path into coaching has definitely been team coaching and group coaching first, you know, and that sort of, you know, that opportunity to work outside of education is really, really important and was certainly formative for me.
Yeah. And then was there any coaching training, or were you kind of like learning on the job as
just going? You know, years and years and years of just learning on the job.
You
know, in the UK there wasn't quite, I mean, I certainly don't ever remember having the opportunity to have a coach or to you know, to develop coaching as a set of skills as an emerging leader. Which is, you know, I think is changing. I don't know the situation necessarily so much in the UK nowadays, but I think there's more obvious opportunities to kind of grow that skill set. So anything that I bring to a coaching partnership is just from the work that I've done over countless hours in many different countries. You know, there's something unique about the challenge of having to travel to a place that you don't know about and meet people that you don't know and then work with them for a period of time in an industry that isn't yours. You know, there's certain, you know, there's certain skills that are kind of forged, I think, in that way that I don't think you can create in another way. So it's there's certainly an element of my work is about how to facilitate. I think the facilitation skills that I've kind of developed over years is something I'm also really proud of.
Yeah. And I don't know whether it's, you know, the red car phenomenon, like once you start thinking about a red car, then you see them. But I took on a coach about a year ago, and so now I just see it everywhere. And I started, you know, and knowing that you were, you know, coaching friends of mine. And I started to notice how many coaches there were, you know, particularly through more engagement on LinkedIn, saw how many coaches there were, and so saw how many people were taking on coaches. And it really got me thinking about, you know, what is kind of missing in educational leadership from our institutions, you know, both university and school system institutions, that has led to us needing to go outside, you know, those institutions to get that coaching and mentoring. And then I think, well, maybe that's not a bad thing. As you say, kind of going out of the industry is a positive, but it does make me think about perhaps there's a lack of leadership, you know, real authentic leadership training in our institutions.
I've always wondered, I would have to agree, and it's certainly been a pattern over the years. I have, it's actually more of a question than a pattern, but it's a question an inquiry I've often had about that, you know, that emerging leadership space. Like, how do you, what are the connecting dots to, what does that even look like nowadays? You know, like, how does it, you know, how do you meet people where they're at? How do you, and I think coaching does that, even though it's very high, it's a high resource. So it's like something that's a high investment. It has the best potential of meeting someone where they're at. It's very, can be very responsive to suit the need of that particular individual. And so we know that that's like on that end of the spectrum, it's something that's likely to have some of the most direct impact. You know, what happens is typically you get much more general approaches to, you know, you're part of a emerging kind of leadership program, or you're a new deputy, you know, and you go to these 2-day conferences and stuff. And, you know, it's a different approach. It's a broader, more efficient kind of standard, kind of scaled part of that model. Is actually what is likely to be needed. And then this is the other thing, Joe, is the issue about, it's not an issue, but it's just a reality that we face, is that context is so important. That when you're an emerging leader, or you're a leader, you have ambitions for that. Whenever you're learning outside of that space, you want to bring that back in. It's quite difficult to bring some of those ideas and transfer them back in. I often wonder if there's actually quite a lot of, you know, you lose quite a lot from trying to move that idea that seems to kind of make sense when I'm over here in this sort of conference space, or I've done this great workshop, I've done a course, but to transfer it into reality. I think that that's often much more difficult than we think.
Yes.
And I think so. Context does this is a strong filter for some of that work, and so the idea of a coach being much more on the ground with you at that point, like being able to be very, very focused in the context, I think is one of the benefits of that particular thing. And I think so. I've often questioned about, what are we doing to support, the next leaders? And I think that I'm still not totally convinced that there's a good link between the investment that we're making in a more executive, for want of a better word, leadership, and those who are ready to kind of step into that space.
Yes.
I'm not sure if those, paths or steps or, dots are connected quite yet.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it, did require me to go and search that, coaching for myself. And the other thing, just thinking back to your metaphor about the iceberg, because often I wonder, I love working where I am, and I don't want to, it's a really great place to work. And also I would have liked, more mentorship, and it's great that the university is now investing in that now. And then I also wonder about that iceberg and how much, because with my life coach, because he's outside of the institution, I feel like I can, I can give him my whole heart, and without the fear of, is there, if I share this, part of my life with the institution, is that going to negatively affect, my stand in the organization? So there's a level of safety in going outside of the institution that I don't know whether I would necessarily feel with a mentor within the institution.
Perhaps that has to do with the way that coaching or mentorship is kind of perceived or framed within the organization. And I think that's the challenge often, is that it gets carved up into being a particular thing. I think when you start to mix evaluative kind of methods or performance, with coaching, or it starts to collide a little bit.
Yeah.
It might not even be necessarily something that's deliberate or intentional, but when somebody learns something new about people because you're in that safe environment of coaching in an organization, how does that, we know that will naturally have a knock-on effect in terms of how that person might perceive something in the future. And I think so the conflating of evaluative performance measures and coaching is often a weak spot of poor kind of coaching rollout, and I think you're right. I think, the potential of coaching comes from, the ability of that relationship to be all accepting of wherever you go. And I think if you kind of get to a kind of a fence line and you kind of go, I'm going to hold back something there. Yeah. I think that I'm not sure it's always necessarily detrimental, but I think that it's certainly not quite as, it doesn't quite fulfill the potential of, the method that you're working in.
Yeah. So when you're working with schools, and I know you've been working with the school my kids go to, and so that whole coaching methodology happens at the leadership level. Does that also then happen in the teaching level, or is it kind of followed through by the leader into the school? So how does?
Yeah, I mean, so working directly with the school often then kind of mixes some of those methods a little bit. So instead of it perhaps being a pure kind of coaching relationship that you're trying to build with every individual that you come across, it actually is more, working with, a leadership group, supporting strategic development, design, curriculum development, those types of things. So working maybe in that kind of team scenario. I spent a lot of time supporting teachers, just sitting and designing learning together. I think that is such an important process, such an important design process, highly creative, highly challenging, and being able to support that kind of process, sitting with a team, 2 or 3 people, individuals, whoever it is, and just looking at what we're working on, looking at what we're learning, and designing something from that. So that's the type of experience that would, you would see me kind of participating in when I'm with schools. It's often a mixture of, team coaching with leaders, with learning design with teachers. And so being able to kind of mix both of those, I think is really, really powerful.
Yeah. And what I see within the school is that there's consistency across the school in their approach to design. So there's absolutely individual creativity within that, but you see a consistent approach from the school, from kindergarten, to year 6. There's less of a phenomena of wanting a particular teacher, although there is, teachers that I see, from a parent point of view would, relate to my child better than others. But in terms of definitely a learning point of view, there's 100% consistency across the school, and the teacher talk as well is very consistent. So they all talk about, teaching and learning and that cycle in a similar way. So you feel like, and I don't know whether the other parents realize it, but definitely from an educator's point of view, you can see that there's deep thinking in the pedagogy, within the teachers, because they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, and so where does that come from? Where does that, and how I kind of see that's the long tail result. Yeah. That's the consistent application of ideas that have been built and kind of created and crafted and refined over years. And I think that at the very beginning of that journey is if I'm fortunate enough and privileged enough to be at that beginning point with teachers and leaders, then it's like, what are we focusing on here? What's the kind of identity that we're trying to craft? What is it what does learning look like? What does great learning look like here? It's often that simple question. It's like, for us here, what is it? And the word here is really important because it's very contextual. What does this community need? What do these kids need? What do these families need? How do we, what is it that we're designing? And so those conversations with leaders are really critical to set the frame of reference, the frame of thinking, the frame of language around learning. And for that to be simply communicated, applied consistently, and for teachers to pick that up and go, that's our mental model for the design of learning here. And so these are the things I need to focus on when I sit down and think about my students and what's next for them.
Yeah, God, incredible. I've just got goosebumps. It's like what a great way to approach learning in schools, and such a collaborative model that is just, I mean, even thinking from a university point of view, we're so focused on kind of teaching the individual, getting the individual human being to a certain level of teaching competency, and there's just not enough time, space to really actually look at the students in terms of my students in terms of a kind of teaching body or a kind of collaborative group of students. And I don't necessarily think we couldn't do that because, theoretically, most of them would move on, from first year to second year, third year and fourth year. So kind of building that group. Anyway, you got me thinking, Tom.
Yeah. As far as, I'm very fortunate to have the chance to work with some new schools. That's something that I think is quite a unique experience. I'm currently working with 2 new schools. So Adelaide Botanic High School is a brand new high school over in the CBD of Adelaide. They've been open a couple of years now, but I was lucky enough to support them and continue to support them now before they even opened. And it's just that kind of time. And I think this is these are interesting stories that we should be told about innovation within education, because what often happens within our schools is that we feel the incumbent structure of what's already there is the thing that is, we just want to get out of the way. And so in these new schools, there isn't like something there, they're starting from a kind of very clear slate. They're trying to create something that wasn't there before. And there's much more opportunity. And so in those circumstances, what happens to us? What happens to us as leaders? What happens to us as teachers? And I think it's just fascinating to kind of see that happening and to support some schools along the way. There's another one here in Melbourne, Casey Fields Primary School. They opened at the beginning of last year. And, they've had quite a tumultuous kind of year and a bit. But it is fascinating to kind of see them, working out what is it that we stand for? Like, what are we going to focus on? What does this community need?
And can that, I'm thinking about, the inevitable, changing of teachers. So is that kind of culture that you create dependent on the leader staying, or is there a way that you can sustain that, culture or that cultural practice so that it lasts beyond, can you even change leadership, or is it dependent on leadership?
Yeah, that's a really interesting truth, isn't it, about all of our schools and organizations, is that people move on, people leave. And I think that the second question that we should be thinking is then, well, what do they take with them? And I think that, there's that that notion of how much of it is a heuristic, and so how much of it is a question in people's minds, or it's the way that person did that, and how much of it has become something that's a standard approach. And so standardization has also the kind of a bad rap for when we think about it in terms of assessment. But the word standardization enables us to kind of take the great things that we're doing and make it accessible for every student. So how do you standardize the experience in the right way? How do you take something that has a really high impact and ensure that every student experiences that? And I think that when you think about it in terms of people leaving, what are they taking with them? And what do we want to make sure that we move beyond a heuristic into something that is a standard algorithm? There's a chap called Roger Martin who wrote The Design of Business, and he talks about the knowledge funnel. So at the top are our questions, like, how do we figure this? How do we do this? Our heuristics are in the middle. And that's the, individual teachers doing things their way. When they leave, they take it with them. Nobody knows how to do it. How do we do that thing? Or they've left now. They, wish they had written it down. And then below the heuristic level is the algorithm, is the standard, is the approach that we can repeat. And I think that when you're thinking about a culture of learning, when you're thinking about our approach to learning, what is it that we're focused on? Those things have to be experimented and explored at an individual level. So there has to be enough freedom for people to express that, because teaching and education needs that. It needs all of us to bring ourselves to our work. We can't drive that out. It's not a kind of cookie cutter. But we also need to know that there's this highly equitable, accessible model of thinking and teaching and learning that everybody can access.
What's missing then from our education system, either university level or that would allow that to be a part of, be just an essential part of our, how do you get that standardized approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult. There's lots of things that are the incumbent structures. So those things those significant pillars of what we think education is.
Yes.
And I think there's lots of that actually still gets in the way.
Yeah.
So faced with a blank kind of slate, we put in there things that we thought worked, but actually were a kind of a weight on us, holding us down. And so, this is sort of grammar of schooling territory, this idea, where these structures that seem to be very, that they have a huge influence over the way that we work. So I'm talking like timetabling, or the organization of students into groups, age related versus, phase related or ability related. And so the kind of structures and the kind of slicing and dicing and organization of people and things, I think actually that gets in the way. It gets in the way of what, individual students actually need, and that's you know, that could be very, very different across multiple subjects or multiple areas of interest. You know, they might need to be working at year 6 level in literacy, but, you know, year 9 in mathematics.
Yes.
But, you know, even philosophically that you might agree, but then the structures within our organizations don't enable that.
Yeah.
So I think being able to kind of work at a philosophical level where we are in agreement about our, you know, our vision for learning, but then also, you know, erode those structures that actually get in the way of, you know, enabling that. That's, I think, something that's got to change.
Yes.
So when we let's loop back to our talk about creativity.
Yeah.
We need time.
Yes.
So how do you enable longer periods of time so students could get into deep work? And, you know, we all talk about flow and understand it. Like, yeah, I'm going to get into the flow and, you know, spend longer. Okay, well, why are our sessions like 45 minutes long? You know, why 55 minutes? And then they're moving on to something else, you know? So I think you're trying to work on what our system needs is that the ability to kind of pull some of those structures down and then build, and with viable alternatives. This is not just doing it for the sake of it.
Yes.
And sort of, you know, explore and experiment with viable alternatives that are actually enabling structures, not, you know, structures that impose limits on us.
Yeah. And this is the conversation that I think we need to have as educators, like coming out, well, not coming out of the pandemic, we're still part of it. Because it's just really struck me that we have, as a profession, still, you know, we've come to realize what's actually important, or, you know, what in terms of schools, and that's relationship between teachers and students. And that's the very thing that's been taken away from, you know, remotely. You know, when we go into remote learning, it's been taken away, and absolutely schools are doing their best to focus on that well-being and connection with students, but it's still, you know, and I guess this is kind of a personal, you know, as a mother of 2 boys that are really struggling with remote learning, I know that's what they're missing, is that relationship with their fellow peers and with their teacher. It's just, as much as the school is just incredible, it's just not meeting, you know, it's not meeting the needs. And, you know, as we talk about remote learning, I just feel like that's the kind of missing part of the conversation, is that we have a real opportunity here to think about what are schools for and why we have them, and then to come out of the pandemic, you know, newly, you know, with learning what we've learned from.
Yeah. I've got a year 10 son who's also, you know, really, we're in the sixth lockdown, so he's had quite a weird experience of it all, and certainly, you know, he's missing those connections, and he's missing the experience of learning with his peers. You know, they're finding ways to kind of figure that out with their various kind of technologies and back channels and house parties or whatever, you know, and which is, you know, fascinating to see how that some of those relationships are being kind of, you know, I think actually kind of being pushed together in a way, when they're able to do that, when they have the agency to be able to, and technology and freedoms to be able to kind of just figure it out and make it work. I wrote something recently about that idea of whether schools will, you know, how that response might, you know, occur. And I kind of put it into a little 3-part mental model, which is the idea of a restart, a reframe, or a reforge. So we're either restarting and just kind of like start it back up again as if nothing had happened. We're reframing the opportunity, so we're sort of shift our frame of reference is different, or we're recasting, you know, that notion of forging something completely different that didn't actually exist before. And I think it's just we're in an interesting place, and schools are definitely in that sort of time as we sort of look at what's ahead of us and we look a little bit further afield. But one thing we know is that, you know, all, you know, teachers have been able to adapt so rapidly, and as many schools have, you know, accelerated their growth around digital learning at such a rate that, you know, the kind of lid is off that one now. You can't ever say that you can't do things at that speed.
I know, right?
You know, so it's not that we would want to, but it would out of choice. But it certainly proves that the development at scale, you know, is something that we can fulfill, and we can, you know, we can still be effective, you know, even without the ideal circumstances. So the idea, but that idea of restarting, I think is you know, isn't the best choice. I think we've got is much more of a great, we've got a great opportunity to reframe our thinking, maybe recast some things that need a different shape, that need a different approach, that need a different set of energies and a set of kind of ideas around.
Amazing. Well, Tom, it's just been such a joy to talk to you. I could really go on for hours, but I assume you have more schools to transform. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to chat with you.
And that's another episode of Teaching Heroes. See you all next week. Bye.